Hi everyone, well this is something a bit new from me. I'm going to show you how I painted this 75mm dwarf figure from RN Estudio. His name's Garaldir, or Garaldir, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, and he was an awful lot of fun to paint. This is going to be split across two videos, but I'm also going to be creating a cool diorama base for him, so watch out for that. So I started off with Bugman's Glow from Citadel, and I painted this over all the flesh. You can see I'm using a wet palette here. It helps to keep the paints wet, but it also helps them flow more easily. I also add a little bit of water to the paint each time. It's better to go in several thin coats rather than one big gloopy load. And next I made a 50-50 mix of Elfic Flesh and contrast medium, again from Citadel, and I used this to glaze all of the Bugman's Glow flesh, once it had dried of course. By the way, if I'm mispronouncing any of the names of these paints, I'm sorry. Now I mixed in a little bit of Dwarf Skin from Vallejo into the Bugman's Glow to create a slightly lighter tone, and I highlighted the raised areas of the flesh. I mixed a little of the Elfic Flesh with the Dwarf Skin to create an even lighter tone, and then I went over the previous highlights, just creating new highlights in a slightly smaller area. I carried on building up the highlights, this time with pure Dwarf Skin. Then I mixed some Elfic Flesh from Vallejo into the Dwarf Skin, and I used this to carry on building up the highlights. I was after a really gradiated look, a really subtle highlighting. And the final highlight was pure Elfic Flesh. To create some shadows, I used a very small and slightly thinned out amount of Reichland Flesh shade, and I painted it in the underside areas and in all the recesses. And that was the skin complete. I gave the hair an undercoat of leather belt from Vallejo. Not forgetting the eyebrows. Now I left a little bit of skin showing towards the back of the eyebrows. I thought this would be more of a heavy brow than actual hair. And for the first highlight layer, I added some orange red from Vallejo into the leather belt. Then I used pure orange red for the next highlight layer, and you can see I made a small mistake there, but I just wiped it away with my finger. And I was focusing these highlights more towards the top of the head and the very ends of the hair. And then I applied some Agrax Earth shade from Citadel over the entire beard and hair. Once the wash had dried, I went back in with some orange red and touched up the highlights. Finally, I added some Vallejo gold yellow to the orange red and created the final highlights, again focusing on the top of the head and right at the end of the beard and hair. To create a soft separation between the hair and the flesh, I drew in the hairline using some Agrax Earth shade and just followed the hairline all the way around. Eyes are always tricky. I used a very small brush. I believe this was an Insane Detail brush from the Army Painter and some Vallejo white. Then I fairly heavily thinned down some Carroburg Crimson using Lamian Medium, both from Citadel, and applied this gently into the corners and the lower section of the eye. And then for the pupil, I used some black from Vallejo and the same brush, being very careful. But it was quite a big pupil because I then wanted to be filling it in with a bit of blue, and for that I used Periscope from Vallejo mixed with some white from Vallejo and carefully filled in the pupil, leaving a thin black line all the way around the outside. And the final touch was adding a small dot of reflection using white Vallejo. There's a lot of leather on this model, and to start with I used new wood on all of the tan leather areas. This included the bag on his front there and his boots. Oh yes, and his tobacco pouch on the back. Now I went over all the new wood with strong tone from the Army Painter. This is a bit like Agrax Earthshade. And now for the hem, or whatever you want to call it, of his tunic. I wanted a slightly duller look, so I mixed some of the strong tone and the new wood together and painted it where it was needed, not forgetting his collar there. Then I went over that layer with some more strong tone. Then it was back to the tan leather, and I used some new woods just to go back in and highlight the raised areas. And then to create a smooth transition, I used some strong tone and new wood mixed together to blend in the new wood highlights that I'd just created. The next highlight layer was created using a blend of new wood with light mud, again from Vallejo. You can see I almost always use some of the previous highlight colour as I progress through the highlights, getting successively lighter, and this is because I want to create a really subtle highlighting effect. Next I used the side of my brush to edge highlight the rim or lip of his boots and other extreme edges using pure light mud. Then I made the deepest shadows darker using some more strong tone from the Army Painter. But only in the very shadowed areas, not over the entire piece of leather. Now, since I had black to hand, I decided to paint in the shoes at this stage. The main reason I'd got the black out was to paint the edges of his mail armour here, which is also leather, but I also used it to begin blocking in his tunic, ready for colour later on. But as it turned out, I didn't start painting the shoulder pad bits for a while, so instead I used some of the black and some dark mud to just tone down the leather around his tunic, and then I highlighted that with some dark mud from Vallejo, and then added a little bit of light mud into the mix and started highlighting that. Initially horizontally as I'd done the other leathers, but then I decided to use a more vertical kind of pattern which matched the texture of the leather underneath. I then added more light mud to the mix and used the same technique, but just highlighting the upper edges of the leather. And then I applied some more light mud using a dry brush, or actually this is a concealer brush, top tip there, and dry brushed, or rather dry stippled, the light mud over the textured leather that I'd just created before softening the look of all that paint with appropriately named soft tone from the Army Painter, just going over the entire trim. Trim, that's the word I was looking for earlier. And now with some strong tone, I just painted a line down the centre of the trim to lend some shadow and depth to it. And finally I went back in and re-highlighted the edges using some light mud and following the same technique as before with the vertical striping, if you like. Now for his leather belt and straps I used what else but leather belt from Vallejo. I then added some strong tone down the centre of the belt and on the straps to create the shadows, before going in with some leather brown from Vallejo, which is slightly lighter, and highlighting the top edges of the belt, more the top half really. And then once all that had dried, I used the leather belt again to create highlights along the straps and the belt itself, not forgetting those little straps on his arm. And then I used the vertical line highlighting technique that we saw on the trim earlier, just to create that really old leathery look on the belt. Then I used some strong tone along the centre of the belt, and finally some stencil from Vallejo to create the edge highlights. And then it was onto his arm guards, and for the undercoat I used some leather belt again, mixed with some leather brown. And then I moved on eventually, at last I should say, to the trim of his shoulder armour, using first pure canvas and then canvas mixed with some stencil, and following the texture or the lines in the trim. And then I applied some soft tone over all of that. Once it had dried, you can see I really did jump around quite a lot during this painting process. It was probably because I nipped off to have dinner or something, and then when I came back I'd forgotten where I was or what I was supposed to be painting. Anyway, I moved back onto the arm guards now, just using some dark tone to create a kind of gradiated shadow effect on them. And then I used some leather belt again to go back and redo the very edge trim of them. Then some leather brown on the gloves, which I'd painted at the same time. And also to create the next highlight layer along the trim there. And then finally some canvas from Vallejo to add the very final highlights just along the middle of the curve and along the very edges, which I just softened with some soft tone. So that's the end of part 1. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. Something new from me. Be sure to tune in to episode 2 in this series to watch me complete the painting of this beautiful model. I'll see you then. Cheerio.